On the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, as they believed that the German invasion of Poland was the final straw in the appeasement of the now notorious German leadership. In the following month, the British decided to move the bulk of their fleet that was based near Malta in the Mediterranean and move it further along up into the North Sea. It seemed a tactical good point that in an invasion in Europe, the majority of your fleet would be based up in the North Sea. However, with the ever-increasing strength of the Germans and the ever-increasing influence that they had with their invasions into Western Europe, by the May of 1940, it was decided that the bulk of that fleet was then to return back into the Mediterranean, but not towards Malta. The idea was that they were going to reinforce Alexandria in Egypt, the sort of closest large-scale military naval base closest to the Suez Canal, which was the link towards the Middle East and the oil reserves, but also towards the Empire, India, Burma, and these other Asiatic places of the world. On the 10th of June 1940, the Italians decided to enter into the Second World War conflict in allyship with the Germans, and thus declaring also war on the British. The Italian island of Sicily is just a 20-minute flight from the British-occupied island of Malta. In the early hours of the 11th of June 1940, just one day after this declaration of war, the first Italian bombers and fighters besieged this island, thus beginning the Siege of Malta, which would last for nearly 2.5 years. And that is what we're going to talk about in today's video. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all. From those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another video. As previously mentioned, talking about the Siege of Malta between 1940 and 1942. Now, there's a lot to pack into this video, so let's get straight on it with this consequential siege. The first casualties and hospital admissions caused by this war were recorded as early as 7 in the morning on the 11th of June 1940. And whilst threats hundreds of years prior and in sieges gone by had often come from the sea, the Italians in 1940 decided that the best way and the majorative way to assault and besiege this small Mediterranean island was actually from the skies. As the fighters flew over and the bombers rained down, the Italians decided to target the military infrastructure and capability of the Maltese and the British forces that were there. So, of course, targeting the Grand Harbour would be a good idea, because, well, that is where all the major ports are, that's where all of the vessels are going to dock at. The Italians decided actually that they were going to focus their attempts, at least in this initial phase of the war, to target the 3 major airfields. That being Lucca, which was being turned at this point into a sort of more efficient military airfield by the British. It is now also the international airport today. An airfield that had been constructed near the city of Medina, known as Takali, and the one military base which had any sort of air resistance was a small little airfield to the southeast of the island known as Hal Far. But the best military resistance that the Maltese could throw up against the Italians were faith, hope, and charity. The names of 3 Gloucester Gladiator biplanes that were kept at the Hal Far airfield. The Gloucester Gladiator model of plane had been made largely obsolete by the late 1930s, but the British still decided to send 10 flat-pack crates of these planes to the island of Malta at the very beginning of the year 1940. 2 were kept on constant standby. 3, of course, were sent up in the skies to resist the Italian bombardment, and it was considered that they could hold their own. And the rest were not constructed and kept for spare parts. Now, the names of faith, hope, and charity were actually names that were interchanged between the different aircraft that had been completed and constructed in early 1940. It was actually the Maltese newspapers and general public that had seen these planes in the sky and had given them their referral names. So most documents from the Second World War tend to refer to these aircraft by their serial numbers. But the plane that was often referred to as Faith by the general public and these newspapers actually survived the entirety of the Second World War, and its fuselage is actually kept at Fort St Elmo in an exhibit showcasing other Second World War hardware and other militaria. Now, of course, facing off against the entirety of the Italian Royal Air Force with just 3 Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, crewed by untrained individuals, not even necessarily fighter pilots, would have been a completely impossible thing to do for the entirety of the siege and the entirety of the war. So, over the next year, a series of measures to bolster the defensive capabilities of the island of Malta were put into effect, including garnering 3,000 conscripts between the ages of 16 and 56, creating underground workshops so that the bombardment of the Italian bombers could not affect the production of the war effort. Then there was the airfields. They needed to be reconstructed and rebuilt, and of course the defences bolstered there, at Lucca, Ticali and Hal Far, like I mentioned previously. And thankfully, from the summer of 1941, the British were able to deliver a number of Hurricane and Beaufort planes to make sure that the skies were a little bit more safe for the Maltese down below, so that those 3 Gloucester Gladiators were not all on their own trying to take on the might of the Italian Royal Air Force. And of course, by no means of least importance, the fortifications of the Grand Harbour area, which needed to be fitted with even more anti-aircraft guns, twin guns and other military hardware to push back against the Italian fighters and bombers, but also, of course, when they did come, the Italian and German navies as well. Now, the defence of this Grand Harbour area consisted of 2 lines of defence. The first line, which is closest to the Mediterranean Sea, firstly starts here at Tignes Point, where there was a late 19th century fortification, as well as 2 smaller gun batteries either side. It also housed a barracks for some of the soldiers. Majorly, there was Fort St Elmo, which had been built in the 1550s, but had since been modernised and in the 19th century turned into a munitions depot. In 1937-38, it was fitted out with 5 twin 6-pound guns, so it had the biggest capability to shoot back against anything coming directly toward it. It is, after all, sort of in a more centralised location to shoot back. Then you have Fort Ricasoli, or Riscasoli, as some spellings suggested. This is the biggest fortification that was built in Malta, and it was constructed in the late 1600s. So there was plenty of positions for guns to be placed onto it to again fight back against the Italians and the Germans. And then finally, just slightly off the map, in a sort of southeasterly direction, just past Fort Ricasoli, is Fort Rocco, which again is another sort of gun battery position that was built in the 19th century. The second line of defence was Fort Manuel, which had its own defensive batteries and capabilities, but it was also the sort of push point for a lot of the ships and submarines, either to push back against the Italian and the Germans, but also to come in and import a lot of the desperately needed supplies for the Maltese people as a whole. There are other fortifications that are in this particular area. Fort Rinella, which is even further along the southeastern coastline of the Grand Harbour area, in this sort of portion of Malta. There's Fort St Michael as well, which is a small little battery again, but surprisingly there is also Fort St Angelo, by far the oldest, or one of the oldest fortifications in the entire Maltese island. The foundations of some bits date back to the 1240s. It had been modernised over the course of its lifetime, but from 1900 it was largely an obsolete position. But because of its central location within this Grand Harbour area, it sustained the most bombings of all of the fortifications around it, some 69 separate occasions over the course of that 2.5-year period. And unfortunately, owing to its very, very close proximity to Fort St Angelo, this peninsular area known as Sanglea sustained the most devastation and destruction by the Blitz period and bombardment of the Italian and the German forces. Malta is a fortress which would be extremely exposed to savage bombing. Now, these fortifications are brilliant and they can defend the harbour. But prior to the Second World War, they were still lacking in military hardware, still lacking in the number of guns to shoot back and to take on the Italian and later German aerial and naval assaults. Prior to the Second World War, the British had promised to give 60 medium-sized anti-aircraft guns known as Bofors to defend the entirety of the harbour. In the July of 1939, only 8 were delivered. Not enough to sustain heavy bombardment and to tackle the entirety of the Royal Italian Air Force and the German Luftwaffe. Thankfully, by 1941, 129 of these Bofors had been delivered and later installed into the harbour area. In the December of 1940, the Germans decide that they are going to send the Luftwaffe in order to assist the Italian Regia Aeronautica. Not because the Italians are struggling to fight the Maltese and claim the island of Malta, but actually because the Italian focus and struggle was actually on the North African region, which the British had put up a hearty defence. With the German intervention in the North African campaign, the pendulum would swing ever closer into their favour. And so the Mediterranean Sea itself became an ever increasingly dangerous place to sail through, pretty much under near complete control of the Axis alliance. The small isolated island of Malta relied heavily during the Second World War on Royal Navy supply ships, the Merchant Navy, to keep them fed, keep them supplied, and to continue on in the war effort. Throughout 1941 and into 1942, a lot of these convoys and operations to supply the island of Malta came under increasing pressure, being either sunk, damaged, and limping to the island itself, or even having to just turn around and try again another day. One such operation, known as Operation Excess, left the island of Gibraltar on the 6th of January 1941, carrying with it 4,000 tons worth of ammunition, 3,000 tons worth of potato seeds, and 12 Hurricane planes. More supply and convoy vessels with their Royal Navy escorts would leave from Alexandria, and one such ship coming from the Aegean near Greece, carrying with them more supplies, more ammunitions, but more vitally, nearly 1,000 soldiers to man the guns of the fortresses of the Grand Harbour. Now, these convoys were easily detected by the Italians within about a day of leaving their respective ports. And over the course of the next 4 days, these convoys faced fairly limited resistance. A couple of submarines here and there targeting and missing these convoys, but limited all the same. But on the 10th of January 1941, as these vessels got ever closer to the Maltese Grand Harbour, there was an attack force consisting of some 43 Junker bombers, 18 larger Heinkel bombers, and escorted by 10 Messerschmitt planes, which targeted the convoys and their escort. The brunt of this attack was felt by an escort group known as Force A, which was about 10 separate Royal Navy vessels, mostly destroyers and battleships, but its lead vessel, the HMS Illustrious, was an aircraft carrier, which mobilised all of its Fulmer and Swordfish planes in order to tackle the Messerschmitt Junker and Heinkel bombers. Now, the Illustrious was actually a key target for the Luftwaffe to take out, and so the brunt of the attack in this case was towards the HMS Illustrious because of its size, because of its military capability as an aircraft carrier. It was a major piece in the Royal Navy fleet. Taking it out would be a good start. Now, unfortunately, the Swordfish and Fulmer aircraft that had been put up by the Illustrious were rather unsuccessful in their defence against the German Luftwaffe. They took out a few of the bombers, but not enough to warrant a major victory. A number of them were destroyed, and actually numerous others flew across to the island of Malta to refuel and to rearm themselves, hoping to get back later on. The Illustrious itself was damaged by 3 hard-hitting bombs, but it would have been a lot worse. There were 2 other separate bombs. One actually hit but never actually exploded, and a 5th bomb was a very near miss but had done an extensive number on the rudder mechanism. The Illustrious may have had extensive damage done to it, and at the unfortunate loss of 129 lives, 91 more wounded, but it still managed to survive and make it to the Grand Harbour in Malta, where it spent the next week under major repairs. All bar one of the vessels in Force A was able to make it to Malta under its own steam. The HMS Gallant, however, had struck a mine at about 8:30 in the morning of the 11th of January and had to be towed back to the Grand Harbour in Malta, where it was beached, and unfortunately it was never repaired. Then between the 16th and the 19th of January 1941, whilst docked in the Grand Harbour, the HMS Illustrious was targeted once again by German and Italian bomber aircraft, doing more damage to the vessel and creating more work for repairs. The Illustrious was able to leave port on the 23rd of January, make its way to Alexandria for more significant repairs that needed to be done. But unfortunately, some of the damage was so extensive that in order to become battle ready, it had to leave the Mediterranean entirely and head to the United States. Another one of these convoys was Operation Substance, which left the British Isles on the 13th of July 1941, arriving on the naval base in Gibraltar just a week later. It would then be escorted by the Royal Navy's Force H, which had a variety of different types of vessels, including an aircraft carrier known as the HMS Ark Royal, numerous destroyers, battleships, cruisers, and even a mine layer. In order to throw the Italians off the scent and have a clear, dry run to Malta, the Allied forces decided to throw a whole bunch of radio traffic the Italians' way, making them believe that it was Alexandria where this convoy was actually coming from. But on the 23rd of July 1941, the convoy was detected and attacked by about 14 Italian bombers, as well as 2 motoscafo armato silurantes, known in English as motor torpedo boats. The HMS Ark Royal already had 4 Fulmer aircraft up in the skies, and then scrambled another 7 to give a bit more of the assist. But unfortunately they were not scrambled in time before the bombs started to drop. 2 of these medium-sized bombers targeted the destroyer HMS Fearless and completely sunk it, at the loss of 35 individuals. The 2 motor torpedo boats, meanwhile, targeted the merchant vessel known as the MV Sydney Star, which was actually owned by the Australian Navy. It came to a complete stop because the damage was so extensive, and some 500 Army officers, passengers, and the crew itself had to be evacuated from the vessel and transported to the HMS Nestor, which would then tow the ship to the Grand Harbour, arriving in the early hours of the 24th of July. Roughly half of the merchant navy vessel actually made it to the Grand Harbour in Malta. 7 of the other merchant navy vessels had to be transported back to Gibraltar with the escort of Force H. And on the way back they encountered even more resistance at the cost of a few damages to the vessels here and there. Those remaining 6 vessels that did make it to the Grand Harbour in Malta were easily detected by a reconnaissance seaplane, which was escorted by 42 Italian fighters. The Maltese scrambled 22 Hurricanes, but at a 2-to-1 odds, the Hurricanes were able to push back the Italians, and the vessels in the convoy were able to be safely unloaded. But just 2 days after this convoy had arrived at the Grand Harbour, the Italians would make what would be their only seafaring assault on the island of Malta, using the Decima Flotilla MAS, also known as the 10th Italian Armed Motorboat Flotilla. This attack on Malta consisted of 2 of those torpedo boats that I previously mentioned, 9 explosive torpedo boats, and 2 human torpedoes, alongside a couple of support vessels and about 10 fighter aircraft. Now, the Decima Flotilla was detected off of the Maltese coast at 8:55 p.m. on the 25th of July 1941, but the raid didn't actually start for nearly 8 hours. So the Maltese and the Allied forces had plenty of time to prepare their gun fortresses on the likes of Tignes Point, Fort St Elmo, Fort Ricasoli, and Fort Rocco. Over the course of the next 2 hours, what was supposed to be an Italian mandate to cause maximum damage and disrupt British shipping ended up being a complete and utter disaster. 18 Italians were killed, 17 were captured, and 11 managed to make their escape. Most of the vessels that the Italians had brought with them, all the motorboats, all the torpedoes, were either destroyed, but a couple were actually captured. And 3 of their Italian fighter aircraft were also shot down as well. And on the British side, all that was done in damage and real sort of significant loss was the destruction of 1 Hurricane aircraft out of about 30 that were sent up, and the destruction of St Elmo's Bridge, which is just off of Fort St Elmo. The Italians had tried to break down a torpedo net that was underneath the bridge so that their vessels could get through and of course cause the maximum damage as I just mentioned. But unfortunately, because these torpedoes were so slow and in the wrong place, the destruction of the bridge actually caused one of the bridge spans to collapse and make even more of an obstacle for the Italians to get through. So completely ruining what they would have been able to do had they done it properly. Now, numerous convoys would make it through to the Grand Harbour, delivering hundreds of thousands of tons worth of supplies for the war effort over the course of this 2.5-year siege. But throughout most of the year 1942, things seemed to become increasingly desperate and fraught. Now, Malta is a very strategic position within the Mediterranean Sea, and it had been so for well over 2,000 years, going back even to the time of the Phoenicians. And as you can see from this map, with these radius markers, this was the extent to which the Allies could fight back against the Axis powers. They could reach as far as North Africa and of course into large portions of Italy as well. But unfortunately, despite this capability, the Maltese and the Allied forces seemed to always be on the back foot, seemed to always be on the defence, especially throughout most of 1942. Numerous bombing raids were being made by the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica on the Grand Harbour and other sites around the island. There were numerous Italian mines being laid just outside or surrounding the Grand Harbour area as well. These convoys, supplying and resupplying Malta as an island, were struggling to get through. And despite being able to target about 60% of the Axis alliance and their own resupplying convoys and operations, the domination of the Axis within the Mediterranean Sea only started to wane with the El Alamein campaign in North Africa towards the end of 1942, in October and November of that year. Food scarcity wasn't necessarily an imminently threatening problem, but it would have been had the siege gone on much longer. So, in the January of 1942, the Maltese government decided to create what they would call victory kitchens, a series of food kitchens scattered across the island, collating all of the food that was being supplied and grown on the island and distributing it evenly amongst the people. Also in an effort to cut down on waste levels as well. And the neighbouring island of Gozo, which is part of this sort of Maltese nation, had such a surplus of food being grown because of its smaller population density that a lot of their food and resources were being siphoned into the main bulk of the Maltese island, so that, again, the ensureness of fairness and an even distribution of the food. Within 6 months of this scheme being enacted, there were 47 of these victory kitchens created. And towards the end of the year and into January of 1943, 170 kitchens were created, supplying food for some 175,000 people. One of the last convoy operations to resupply the island of Malta during this siege was known as Operation Pedestal, which occurred in the August of 1942. It was one of the largest and one of the riskiest operations during this conflict, transporting some 30,000 tons worth of supplies to the island. One vessel alone, known as the SS Ohio, an oil tanker from Texas, which was manned by a British crew, held 12,000 tons worth of supplies alone. The risk for protecting this one oil tanker, the SS Ohio, required 50 ships from the combined forces of the British Royal Navy and the United States Navy as well. The convoy left the British Isles on the 3rd of August 1942. arriving at the naval base in Gibraltar just a week later. But as it traversed through the Mediterranean Sea over the next 4 days, this convoy came across over 600 different aircraft from both the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica. Some 300 fighters and 285 bombers, which was backed up by numerous cruisers, destroyers, torpedo boats, and submarines as well. The convoy had 2 aircraft carriers as part of this fleet, which meant that unfortunately only 74 aircraft were able to be scrambled to do battle in the skies with the Germans and the Italians, meaning that the German-Italian forces had outnumbered the British and Americans by 8-1 in total. Only 5 out of the total 14 merchant navy vessels actually made it to the island of Malta. Thankfully, one of those was the SS Ohio. The British also lost one of its aircraft carriers, 2 of its cruisers, and 1 of its destroyers. 34 planes were lost, and at a total personnel loss of about 550 individuals or more. But the rest of the fleet was not unscathed in its transportation. The other aircraft carrier, the HMS Indomitable, suffered extensive damage. 2 of the light cruisers also sustained damage. And the HMS Wolverine, which was one of the Navy's destroyers, only sustained damage because it rammed into one of the Italian submarines. And 3 of the merchant navy vessels that were successful enough to resupply Malta also had significant damage done to them. As a result of the successful delivery of the SS Ohio, as well as the other merchant navy vessels, numerous individuals were given distinguished orders and honours for their bravery and their actions during this convoy and the conflict surrounding the operation. This also included the master of the SS Ohio, a man by the name of Dudley Mason, who was given the George Cross, the highest commendation given by any serviceman by the King of England, George VI. It was commended for skill and courage of the highest order, and it was due to his determination that, in spite of the most persistent enemy opposition, the vessel with her valuable cargo eventually reached Malta and was safely berthed. The merchant seaman never faltered. To him we owe our preservation and our lives. And finally, towards the end of the Siege of Malta, the German and Italian leadership decided to conceptualize a plan called the Unternehmen Hercules, known as Operation Hercules, whereby they were going to send paratroopers, parachute regiments to Malta for an aerial assault that way. The idea was conceptualized in April 1942 to be enacted hopefully in the July of that same year. However, because of recent setbacks in the other campaign fronts of the Second World War, this plan kept being postponed and postponed until finally in November 1942 it was completely cancelled. The end of the Siege of Malta did not occur until the 20th of November 1942, with the successful North African campaign and the Battle of El Alamein swinging the pendulum back in favour of the Allied forces. It meant that Malta could now rest a little bit easier during the Second World War. However, the Italians still fought on, and it wasn't until their outright surrender on September the 8th, 1943, that the Maltese felt that they could be safe once again. A parade was marched through Valletta on the 12th of September, and any Italian assets that had been either left or captured during the Second World War was moored up at St. Paul's Bay to the sort of northwest of the island. A total of 29,000 buildings were destroyed during the Siege of Malta, costing the British government some £30 million. and at a cost of life, sadly, there were 1,540 civilians killed during these bombing raids by the German and the Italian air forces. They turned such blitz upon Malta as no other island or city had seen in war. It was a siege of annihilation. Malta became the most bombed place on Earth. From 1945, 2,500 German prisoners of war were sent to the island of Malta in order to aid in the reconstruction there. They were eventually, though, repatriated to Germany in 1948. Now, this siege, as I'd mentioned at the very beginning, was nearly 2.5 years long, which required all of its people and all of the servicemen stationed there to have great strength, bravery, courage and valour in the face of overwhelming circumstances. It was decided on the 10th of April 1942 that perhaps the George Cross, this singular greatest commendation to be awarded, be given to the entire nation of Malta. 5 days later, this was signed into effect, and the cross itself was delivered to the Maltese people on the 11th of May 1942, accepted in person by the Governor Lieutenant General William Doby. Another high commendation was also given by the United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt on December the 7th, 1943. Known as the Malta Citation, it decrees that the highest commendation be granted to the people of Malta, again for their courage and bravery during the siege that had lasted 2.5 years. Now, as I conclude my video here, I'd just like to say, well, thank you, first of all, for making it to the end. A slightly more longer video than what I usually put out. But I hope that also you have found it interesting. There's slightly more niche aspect to the Second World War and the Second World War history, military history. But it is important. You know, it might be niche, it might be smaller, but it is also important in terms of the sort of wider context of the Second World War. So, without further ado, I'll leave it there. Thank you for watching. Hope you found it interesting, and see you in the next one.